There's a man in Boston who owns half the harbor and most of the silence that comes with it. Everett Crane is 37 years old. He's got the hands of someone who's ended conversations no one else could, and the eyes of a man who stopped wanting anything the night he watched his wife's car burn on a road in Southie 5 years ago. They told him she was dead. DNA confirmed. Casket closed. And Everett, who'd once been the kind of man who laughed loud enough to make his daughter clap her hands over her ears, just stopped. Not stopped living. Exactly, he still runs the empire. Still sits at the head of every table. Still makes grown men look at their shoes when he walks into a room. But he runs it the way you'd run a funeral home. Efficient. Joyless. Like a man who's just waiting for the whole thing to finally collapse so he can stop pretending he cares whether it does. His daughter Lenny is 8. She's got an IQ that makes her teachers nervous and a habit of reading her father's financial ledgers instead of chapter books. She doesn't know her father's the most dangerous man in the city. Or at least, he thinks she doesn't. Because one morning, this little girl, this 8-year-old in a school uniform with her hair still messy from sleep, walks into his office, puts a 4-page handwritten proposal on his desk, and says, "Daddy, your restaurants don't sell enough food for the money they make. I fixed it." And right there, in that moment, Everett Crane realizes 2 things. His daughter's figured out he's laundering money, and her solution to fix it is actually better than anything his lawyers have come up with in a decade. But that's not even the real story. The real story is what Lenny finds next, buried in a locked drawer, in a file no one was supposed to open, a DNA report marked inconclusive, a second test that was never completed, and a question that'll tear this family apart before it puts them back together. What if her mother isn't dead at all? If this story's already got you hooked, do me a favor, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good plot twist, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Now let's go back to the night Everett Crane buried a woman who was still breathing. That night, 5 years earlier, Everett Crane was driving about 4 cars behind his wife on Winter Street in Southie. He remembered that Celeste had been listening to music because she often rolled the window down when she drove at night, letting the wind slip into her hair, a habit he had once teased her about. He remembered the taillights of her car blinking when she turned left at the intersection. Then came the light, not ordinary light, but a kind of light that swallowed everything around it. White first, then orange, then black. The explosion came after the light, or maybe at the same time. He was never certain, because the memory of that moment had never arranged itself in the right order inside his head. Celeste's car burst into flames in the middle of the street. Everett stopped his car, ran toward it, and was held back by 2 passers-by because the fire was too large. He screamed his wife's name until his voice broke. The police came. The fire trucks came. And after that came the kind of silence that only exists when people know it's already too late. The body was burned beyond recognition. DNA was sent for testing. The result came back. A match. The file was closed. The coffin was closed. The funeral was held at St. Monica Church in South Boston on a drizzly Tuesday. Not many people came, because Everett Crane wasn't the kind of man who had friends. He had allies. He had subordinates. He had people who feared him, but friends he didn't have. Lenny was 3 years old then, wearing a black dress Dolores had bought in a hurry from a shop on Charles Street, standing beside her father in the church and asking again and again, "Where's Mommy?" in that small voice only a child of 3 could have. A voice that didn't understand there was no answer to that question. Everett picked his daughter up. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He only held her and stared at the coffin as though he were staring at a door that had just closed, one he knew he would never be able to open again. After the funeral, Everett Crane changed. Not the kind of change people notice at once, but the kind that happens from the inside, like a building that still looks whole from the outside, while all the wiring inside has been stripped out. He stopped smiling, stopped having dinner with his men, stopped sitting on the floor in the evenings to play puzzles with Lenny. He still ran the empire, still gave orders, still made people afraid. But before, he had done those things with a purpose. Now he did them because he didn't know what else to do. The Crane Empire still stood firm then, at least on the surface. 6 restaurants scattered across Boston from Newberry Street to the Seaport District. All of them legal fronts for dirty money flowing through the harbor. Real estate in Back Bay and the South End, bought in cash, transferred through shell companies Frank Whitmore had built as carefully as a man lining up dominoes. Penn, Everett's younger brother, 34 years old, managed the entire financial side and was the only person besides Frank who knew exactly how much money moved through the system each month and how much of it truly existed. Frank handled the legal side, kept everything looking clean on paper, and wore the face of a respectable attorney when necessary, though they both knew that face had begun cracking long ago. Dolores Kovac, 62 years old, kept the Beacon Hill house, cared for Lenny, cooked the meals, and was the only person in the entire system who dared look Everett Crane straight in the eye and say, "You're wrong," without fearing the consequences, because she had been with the Crane family since before Everett knew how to hold a gun, and loyalty like that couldn't be bought and couldn't be threatened. And now, in the present, at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday night, Everett sat in the penthouse in Back Bay, a glass of Macallan aged 25 years on the table, untouched, while the city lights poured through the glass windows from floor to ceiling. Boston lay beneath him like something he owned but no longer wanted to keep. The phone on the table held 14 unread messages, most from Penn, a few from Frank, none from anyone he truly wanted to hear from. He lifted the glass, looked at the city lights shining through the amber liquor, then set it down without drinking. Just like every night, just like everything he had done for the past 5 years. Lift it, look at it, set it down. Not enough desire to drink, not enough courage to pour it away. While Everett Crane sat drinking alone at 3 a.m. in the penthouse, 12 miles to the west, in the mansion on Beacon Hill, his daughter was awake too. Lenny Crane wasn't awake because of nightmares, or because she was afraid of the dark like other 8-year-old children. She was awake because she was halfway through a book on pricing models that she had found on the shelf in her father's study, and she wanted to understand why the profit margin in the example in Chapter 7 was higher than the number she had seen on the spreadsheets for her family's restaurants. Lenny studied at Windsor School, a private all-girls school in Longwood, where 1 year of tuition was enough to buy a decent car, and where the teachers had stopped trying to teach her third-grade math because she finished the problems before they had even finished writing them on the board. She didn't have many friends, not because she wasn't friendly, but because she had a way of speaking that made adults uneasy, the way a child speaks when she understands more than she is allowed to know, and children her own age sensed that instinctively, then kept their distance. Dolores tried to make up for it by telling Lenny about her mother, but she only told her the safe things. Your mother was very beautiful. Your mother loved tulips. Your mother sang beautifully. Lenny listened, nodded, then asked, "What did my mother do for work? And did my mother know how to read spreadsheets? And why didn't anyone keep my mother's computer?" Dolores couldn't answer those questions. She only hugged Lenny and said, "You're so much like your mother." And Lenny let herself be held, but inside her head, the unanswered question kept turning like an unfinished Rubik's Cube. Everything changed on a Thursday afternoon, when Frank Whitmore came to the house to sign papers with Everett. Frank sat at the kitchen table, opened his laptop, and worked while waiting for Everett to come downstairs. Then Frank's phone rang. He got up and stepped out onto the porch to answer it, and the laptop stayed open on the table. Lenny was sitting at the far end of the table eating an apple. She looked over. On the screen was an Excel spreadsheet, many tabs, each tab named after one of the Crane family restaurants. She didn't touch the laptop. She didn't need to touch it. She only looked, and she remembered. That night, in her room, Lenny took out her notebook and copied down everything she had seen. The restaurant names, monthly revenue, ingredient costs, employee wages. She drew a diagram with colored pencils, made tables, compared figures. And she saw something no one thought an 8-year-old child would see. Cranes on Newbury, according to the spreadsheet, had average monthly revenue 4 times higher than the amount a restaurant with 46 seats could possibly make, even if every table were full for every meal, every day, all month long. She knew this because she had once gone to that restaurant with Dolores for lunch on a Tuesday and had counted exactly 4 customers, including the 2 of them. The numbers didn't match, and Lenny Crane was the kind of person who, even at only 8 years old, couldn't accept numbers that didn't match without asking why. She waited until Friday dinner, the only meal of the week when Everett was almost always home. Frank was there that evening too because there were papers that needed signing. Dolores set the table for 4. Lenny sat in her chair, her feet not touching the floor, finished her pasta first, then waited until her father put down his fork. Then she asked, in the most ordinary voice possible, the voice of a child asking about homework, "Daddy, why does Cranes on Newbury make more money on Tuesday than on Saturday? When the time I went there on a Tuesday, there were only 4 people in the whole restaurant?" The dinner table went silent. Not an ordinary silence, but the kind of silence that falls when the air in the room suddenly grows several kilograms heavier. Everett froze, his fork suspended between his plate and his mouth. Frank set his water glass down a little too hard, making water splash onto the tablecloth. Dolores looked up at the ceiling as though praying for someone up there to give her strength. Everett looked at his daughter. Lenny looked back at her father. Her eyes were exactly like her mother's, direct, unblinking, waiting for an answer with the frightening patience of a child who knows adults tend to lie when they're caught off guard, but will tell the truth if they're asked the right question. Everett put his fork down. Restaurants have busier days than others, Lenny. That's how business works. Lenny nodded, but her eyes said she didn't believe a single word of it, and Everett knew. That night, after Lenny went to bed, he stood outside his daughter's bedroom door and, for the first time, realized that the greatest danger to his empire wasn't the police, wasn't a rival, wasn't the FBI. It was an 8-year-old child with a notebook and a set of colored pencils. 3 days after that dinner, Everett walked into his study at 6 a.m. and found a 4-page packet on his desk, written in pencil, fastened together with a pink paperclip, with a sticky note attached to the first page that said, "Read this before your coffee gets cold." The handwriting was childish, neat, tilted slightly to the right, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a little girl who had been taught to write carefully but still hadn't fully learned how to control the size of her letters. Lenny had written a business proposal. Page 1 was a diagram, drawn in colored pencil, with squares representing the 6 restaurants owned by the Crane family, each square holding 2 numbers inside it. One number she labeled real, and one she labeled fake, with a red arrow pointing to the gap between those 2 numbers. Page 2 was the section she called the problem, written clearly, line by line. The restaurant had very few customers but reported a lot of money, and if someone counted the customers and compared that number to the money, they would see it didn't match, just like she had seen. And if she could see it, then grown-ups could see it too. It was only a matter of sooner or later. Page 3 was the section she called the fix, and this was the part that made Everett Crane read it over and over again 3 times. Lenny proposed turning Crane's on Newbury into a real restaurant. Hire a real chef, sell real food, have real customers. The diagram showed a circle with an arrow moving clockwise. Real food led to real customers. Real customers led to real money, and real money meant they didn't need fake numbers anymore. At the bottom of page 3, she wrote 1 line and underlined it twice. If you make real food, you get real customers, and then you don't need the fake numbers anymore, Daddy. Page 4 was a list of things that needed to be done, numbered from 1 to 8, including hire a real chef in the number 1 position and make the garlic bread better in the number 8 position, with a star beside it and a note that said, "This is important." Everett finished reading, set the packet down, picked up his coffee, realized it had gone cold, and set it down again. Then he picked up the packet and read it a second time. Then he called Frank. Frank arrived within 40 minutes, read the proposal while standing in the middle of the study, took off his glasses, put them back on, then sat down in the chair and looked at Everett with the expression of a man who had just been made to feel professionally inadequate by an 8-year-old child. "She's not wrong, Everett. She's actually not wrong." Everett leaned back in his chair. "My 8-year-old daughter just pointed out a hole in my money laundering system that my entire legal team didn't see, and her solution is drawn in colored pencil on paper with Pusheen cats on it." Frank looked back at the packet. "Technically, it really is Pusheen paper. That makes everything worse, Frank." But Everett didn't laugh when he said it, and Frank didn't laugh either, because both of them understood that what had just happened wasn't only the story of a bright little girl writing an adorable proposal. What had just happened was that Lenny Crane had seen straight through the curtain Everett had built to hide his real world from his daughter, and instead of being frightened, instead of crying, instead of running to Dolores to ask why her father had lied, she had sat down, taken out her pencil, and written a plan to fix it. She didn't want to destroy her father's secret. She wanted to turn it into something that didn't have to be a secret anymore. Everett sat very still for a long time after Frank left. He looked at the proposal, looked at his daughter's handwriting, looked at the Pusheen cat in the corner of the paper, and he made his decision. Not because the proposal was perfect. It wasn't perfect. It was the work of an 8-year-old child, and there were at least 3 places where any adult would have found it naive enough to be almost funny. But the core logic was right, and more importantly, for the first time in 5 years, Someone had looked at Everett Crane's rotting empire and, instead of walking away, instead of exploiting it, instead of fearing it, had said, "I can fix this." The fact that this person was only 8 years old and called him Daddy only made it hurt more and feel more beautiful at the very same time. He called Frank for the second time that day and said 4 words Frank Whitmore never expected to hear from Everett Crane's mouth. "Let's try it." Crane's on Newbury reopened 2 weeks later with a real chef named Glenn, whom Frank found from an Italian restaurant in the North End that was about to close. And with a real menu that Lenny had approved by putting stars beside the dishes, she thought, people will really eat, and crossing out the ones she believed nobody's going to order that, Daddy. I saw it on Yelp. But Lenny didn't stop at the restaurant. She kept reading her father's papers. Not out of curiosity anymore, but because she had assigned herself a job no one had asked her to do. And Lenny was the kind of person who, even at only 8 years old, once she started something, wouldn't stop until it was finished. The next discovery came when she Googled the names of the charities the Crane family funded, names she had found in Frank's spreadsheets. 4 organizations. None of them had a website. None of them appeared in the search results beyond a single corporate registration line in the state of Delaware. Lenny didn't fully understand what it meant for a charity to have no website, but she understood that every real organization had a website because her school had one, the church on the corner had one. Even the lemonade stand run by the neighbor's daughter had an Instagram page. So if 4 organizations receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars every year from her father didn't even have one website, then clearly something wasn't right. She wrote a second proposal. This one was shorter, 2 pages, with the Boston Children's Hospital logo that she had printed from her iPad and glued into the corner of the page. The proposal was very simple. Instead of sending money to organizations nobody knew, send it to the Children's Hospital. Her logic, written on the first page in capital letters, was, "If people like you, they don't ask questions. That's what my teacher says about being nice." Everett read his daughter's second proposal in his study at 7 in the evening, still wearing the suit he had come home in from a meeting at the harbor, and he realized he was being backed into a corner by an 8-year-old child, a corner he couldn't escape with money, power, or intimidation. He couldn't tell Lenny that those organizations were fake, because admitting that would mean admitting far too much. He couldn't reject the proposal, because Lenny would ask why, and Lenny's questions were the kind of thing even Everett Crane didn't know how to dodge. So he agreed. And that was how, 3 weeks later, Everett Crane, the man half of Boston was afraid to name, sat on a green plastic chair in a pediatric room on the 4th floor of Boston Children's Hospital, with 2 bodyguards standing in the hallway looking like 2 freezers someone had put in the wrong place, reading The Very Hungry Caterpillar to a 5-year-old girl undergoing chemotherapy named Becca. Lenny had insisted that her father had to go in person because people need to see you there, not just see your money, Daddy. Those are 2 different things. The nurse looked at him the way people look at a bear someone has brought into a library, frightened and not entirely sure who to call. Everett sat there, the thin book open on his lap, reading in a monotone voice, as though he were reading a third-quarter financial report. Becca, bald from chemotherapy, her hospital blanket pulled up to her chin, looked at him and said, "You're doing it wrong. You gotta do the voices." Everett looked at the little girl. Voices. Yeah, the caterpillar voice. He's little, so he talks little. Everett Crane, the man who had once ordered things that should never be repeated in any story, drew in a breath, looked down at the page with the green caterpillar eating an apple, and did the caterpillar's voice. Small, high, a little unsteady, the voice of a man who had never done this in his life, and was trying not to feel ridiculous, while the 2 bodyguards outside the door bit their lips and looked away. Becca laughed, a small laugh, hoarse from medication, but real. Then she asked, in the most ordinary voice, "Are you somebody's daddy?" "Yeah. You look sad for a daddy." Everett didn't answer. He turned to the next page and kept reading in the caterpillar's voice, but something inside his chest shifted, like a door someone had pushed slightly open before he could close it again. That night, when he came home, he didn't go into his study. He didn't pour Macallan. He didn't read Penn's messages. He went up the stairs, stopped at Lenny's bedroom door, and sat down on the floor, his back against the doorframe, watching his daughter sleep through the narrow opening. Lenny lay on her side, her hair spread across the pillow, one hand still resting on the notebook she carried everywhere. Everett sat there for a very long time, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt something that wasn't anger, wasn't emptiness, wasn't the kind of numbness he had grown so used to that he had mistaken it for normal. He didn't know what to call it yet, but it was there, small, warm, and real. The next week, Lenny asked to go to Crane's on Newbury for a taste test. Dolores took her there at noon on Saturday. The restaurant was still quiet, newly reopened, with no regular customers yet, but Glenn had cooked the new menu, and the smell of garlic spilled all the way out to the sidewalk. Lenny sat at the corner table, ordered pasta and garlic bread, and ate slowly with the serious expression of a miniature food critic. That evening, when Everett came home, Lenny was waiting on the stairs. "The pasta's okay," she said, "but the garlic bread needs work, Daddy." Everett looked at his daughter, and for the first time in a very long while, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile. Not yet, but close. Lenny didn't mean to find it. She went down to the basement on a Wednesday afternoon because the printer upstairs was out of ink, and she needed to print a chart comparing the first month of revenue from Crane's on Newbury as a real restaurant with the previous 4 months of Crane's on Newbury as a money laundering operation, because she was preparing what she called a progress report for her father. The basement office was Frank's second workspace, where he kept old files, the printer, and the things he didn't want anyone upstairs to see. Lenny knew the printer password because Dolores had given it to her the last time she needed to print the restaurant proposal. She sat waiting for the printer to start, turned the chair, and her eyes stopped on the bottom right drawer of Frank's desk. The drawer had a digital combination lock. The 2 drawers above it did not. Only the bottom drawer was secured this way. And Lenny Crane was the kind of child who, when she saw a code, didn't just see numbers, she saw a pattern waiting to be solved. She recalled the Excel spreadsheets she had memorized from Frank's laptop earlier. She knew Frank had a strict habit of basing his passwords on the secret revenue digits of their Newbury restaurant. Running the financial sequences through her head like a mathematical puzzle, she calculated the variations Frank would logically use to protect his most private files. She entered the 4-digit code. The lock clicked open on her very first attempt. Inside were 3 folders. One folder was labeled Insurance, one was labeled Property, and one, thinner than the other 2, was labeled C. Crane, November, written in blue ink in Frank's handwriting. C. Crane, Celeste Crane, her mother. November, the month her mother died. Lenny opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly, the first time her hands had trembled since she had begun this unofficial investigation. And inside were 4 sheets of paper. The first sheet was a DNA report from a laboratory called Biogenesis Labs in Quincy. Lenny didn't understand all the medical terminology, but she understood numbers, and she understood the bold line at the bottom of the page. Result: inconclusive. Sample degraded. Secondary sample recommended. Inconclusive. She knew this word. It meant they couldn't determine it. Not yes, not no. The second sheet was Frank's handwritten note, on paper bearing the letterhead of his law office, and its content was brief. DNA sample inconclusive. Second sample requested. P. Crane confirmed match via independent verification. File closed, per E. Crane instruction. P. Crane. Penn Crane. Uncle Penn was the one who confirmed the match, but the first result hadn't matched. It was inconclusive, and a second sample had been requested, yet the note didn't say whether the second sample had ever been taken. Frank closed the file because Penn said it matched, and her father agreed to close it. Lenny set the paper down. She sat very still in the quiet basement room, the fluorescent light humming overhead, the printer still starting up with a small mechanical sound, and she thought the way her father thought, not with emotion first, but with logic first, with emotion left for later. If the DNA couldn't be determined, then no one knew for certain that the person in the car was her mother. If no one knew for certain, then there was a chance it wasn't her mother. If it wasn't her mother, then her mother might still be alive. She didn't tell her father. Not yet. She went to find Dolores. Dolores was in the kitchen, making soup for dinner, and when Lenny placed the DNA report on the kitchen table beside the cutting board of onions, Dolores looked at the paper, then looked at Lenny, then looked back at the paper, and put the knife down very slowly. "Where did you find this?" "In Uncle Frank's desk in the basement." "You're not supposed to go through other people's things, Lenny." "Mrs. Dolores. Inconclusive means they didn't know for sure, right?" Dolores didn't answer right away. She wiped her hands on her apron, pulled out a chair, sat down at Lenny's eye level, and stayed silent for a long while. Then she said, in a small voice, the voice of someone who had held something inside for too long and was tired of holding it. I always felt something wasn't right. I told your father, but your father wouldn't listen, because if there was hope, and that hope was wrong, your father wouldn't survive it a second time. Your father would rather believe your mother was dead than hope and lose her all over again. Lenny listened, nodded. Then she went up to her room, got her iPad, and began searching. She typed into Google, "Woman found no memory, Boston area," then added the year her mother died. The 14th result, on page 3, was a short article from the Worcester Telegram, in the local news section, published 2 weeks after her mother's funeral. The headline was, "Unidentified woman found wandering Route 9 near Shrewsbury. Head trauma, no memory." The article was short, 7 lines, with a blurry photo taken from a security camera at UMass Memorial Hospital. The woman in the photo was wearing a hospital gown, her hair messy, her face turned to the side, unclear, but Lenny didn't need it to be clear. She ran into her father's room, took the photo of her mother from the bedside table, ran back, and placed the 2 photos side by side on the bed. The outline of the face, the shape of the ear, and the small mole on the neck, on the left side, just below the jawbone. The mole that could still be seen in the blurry photo because it was exactly where the hospital light fell. Lenny looked at the 2 photos for a very long time. Then she went down to the kitchen, where Dolores was still sitting, still not having stood up since Lenny left, her eyes red, her hand still gripping her apron. Lenny placed the iPad with the article on the table beside the photo of her mother. "That's my mom," Dolores looked, and she cried, not aloud, but with tears running down while her face stayed the same. The way people who have held on to pain for too long finally let it escape on its own. Lenny didn't cry. She stood beside the kitchen table, both hands resting on the surface, and went into complete silence, the kind of silence exactly like her father's when he was thinking about something too large to say out loud. Then she said, in a very small voice, very calm, so calm that Dolores had to look again to make sure this was still an 8-year-old child and not someone else. "We have to tell Daddy, but we have to be careful. Daddy breaks things when he's scared." Lenny waited 2 days. Not because she wasn't certain, but because she needed to choose the right moment. And she understood her father well enough to know that timing mattered just as much as the content itself. She chose Sunday morning. Her father was always calmest on Sunday morning, after getting a few rare hours of sleep, because there were no meetings and no calls from the harbor, and after finishing the first cup of coffee Dolores had made for him since 6 o'clock. Lenny waited for her father to finish his coffee. She waited for him to set the cup down. Then she entered the study, where Everett was sitting behind the large oak desk he had sat behind every morning for the past 10 years. The desk Celeste used to sit on every night when he worked late, her legs swinging, reading the ledgers, and asking him the questions no one else asked. Lenny carried a folder with her. She placed the folder on the desk, opened it, and arranged 4 things in a straight line in front of her father. The DNA report from Biogenesis Labs with the word "inconclusive" circled in red pen, Frank's handwritten note with the line P, Crane confirmed match, underlined, the photograph of her mother from her father's nightstand, and the iPad already open to the Worcester Telegram article, with the blurry photograph of the woman with amnesia. She arranged them from left to right, perfectly aligned, evenly spaced, with the precision of a child who had rehearsed this presentation in her mind for 2 days. Then she spoke. "I think Mommy is alive, Daddy, and I think somebody lied to you." Everett looked down at the 4 things on the desk. His eyes moved from left to right, slowly, one item at a time. They stopped on Lenny's photograph of her mother, stopped on the article, returned to the DNA report. He said nothing. His face didn't change. Still the face everyone in the Crane organization knew, the face that never let anyone know what he was thinking. But his hand was trembling. Lenny saw it. Her father's right hand, resting on the surface of the oak desk, trembled slightly. And it was the first time in her life she had ever seen her father shake. Not from cold, not from anger, from something Lenny didn't yet have enough words to name, but she could feel it. Something that was fear and hope and rage all at once, all pressed into one hand, trembling on the desk. "Lenny," his voice was calm, controlled. "Go up to your room. But Daddy, go upstairs. Now. Right now." Lenny looked at her father. She wanted to stay, wanted to explain more, wanted to show him the mole on the neck in both photographs. But she also understood that there were times when her father needed to be alone, not because he wanted to be alone, but because something inside him was about to break open, and he wouldn't let his daughter see that. She went up to her room. Dolores was waiting on the stairs, her eyes full of worry. Lenny took her hand and said, "I told him," and Dolores nodded, then led her upstairs without asking anything more. Downstairs, the study door closed. And then came the sound of breaking. Lenny heard it from her room. The sound of something heavy striking the wall. The sound of a bookshelf toppling, books spilling onto the floor in a hard rush. The sound of glass shattering, maybe the desk lamp or a picture frame. Then something larger, heavier, and Lenny knew it was the sound of the oak desk being overturned, the desk her mother used to sit on, the desk her father had kept in the same place for 5 years, as though keeping a shrine, now flipped upside down by Everett Crane, in the fury he had been holding in since the night he watched his wife's car burn on Winter Street. Then silence. A very long silence. Dolores sat beside Lenny on the bed, holding her, and both of them listened to that silence as though listening to a man gathering the broken pieces inside himself. At 11 o'clock that night, Frank Whitmore was called to the house. He arrived within 15 minutes, still in his pajamas with a coat thrown over them, and stepped into the study to find Everett standing in the middle of the wreckage. The desk overturned, books scattered across the floor, liquor spilled, glass broken. Everett wasn't shouting. His voice was low, controlled. The kind of control Frank knew was more dangerous than any scream. The DNA result. Inconclusive. You knew. It wasn't a question. I knew. Why wasn't I told? Penn said he'd handle it. Penn said he verified it again, that the sample matched. I trusted Penn. He's your brother. Silence. That was my mistake, Everett. I should have checked it myself instead of trusting Penn. Everett looked at Frank for a very long time. Then he said, "Find me someone to verify it. Not through Penn. No one Penn knows. 48 hours. Frank nodded and left. 48 hours later, the result came back. The fingerprints from the UMass Memorial Hospital records, where the woman with amnesia had been taken 5 years earlier, matched Celeste Crane's fingerprints in the Massachusetts State Records System. That woman was now living in Somerville under the name Margot Fielding, issued temporary papers after being discharged from the hospital, currently working at a small bakery called Greer's Bakery on Holland Street. Everett sat in the study that had been cleaned up, the oak desk set back in its proper place, holding the report in his hand. His wife was alive. 5 years, 12 miles from where he sat every night drinking alone, believing she was lying beneath the earth. 12 miles from the Beacon Hill mansion, where Everett Crane was holding the report, confirming that his wife was alive. A woman named Margot Fielding woke at 3:45 in the morning as she did every day, turned off the alarm before it had the chance to ring because she always woke before the alarm, and sat on the edge of the bed in her small studio on Elm Street in Somerville, looking out the window for 30 seconds before standing up. Those 30 seconds were a habit she couldn't break. The space between sleep and waking when she tried to hold on to any image from her dreams before it dissolved, because dreams were the only place where she had anything resembling a past. The studio had only one room, a small kitchen, a walk-in shower, and one window that looked out over the back alley, where stray cats often sat on the trash cans at dawn. The walls were bare. No family photographs, because there was no family to photograph. Or more precisely, because she didn't remember having any family to photograph. On the bedside table, there were 2 things: a sketchbook and a pencil. She washed her face, put on jeans and a t-shirt, pulled on a hoodie because mornings in Somerville were still cold even though spring had arrived, then walked 12 minutes to Greer's Bakery on Holland Street. She took the same road every day, past the same houses, the same laundromat that hadn't opened yet, the same maple tree on the corner of Davis that she liked because it leaned to one side as though trying to look across the street. She knew this road by heart, but she didn't know what road had brought her here. 5 years earlier, a truck driver found her on the shoulder of Route 9 near Shrewsbury, about 40 miles west of Boston. She was walking along the road barefoot, her shirt torn at the shoulder, dried blood on her forehead, her eyes open but looking as if they saw nothing. The driver called 911. An ambulance took her to UMass Memorial in Worcester. Severe head trauma, brain swelling, 2 weeks in intensive care. When she woke, she didn't know who she was. She didn't know her name, didn't know where she was, didn't know why she had been lying on the road in the middle of the night with a wound on her head. The police searched the missing persons system but found no match. because Celeste Crane wasn't on the missing persons list. She was on the list of the dead, with the coffin closed, the file closed, the DNA confirmed. The hospital gave her a temporary name, Jane Doe, and later, when discharge paperwork was needed, a social worker helped her register under a new name. She chose Margot because it was the name on the cover of a book someone had left behind on a hospital table, and Fielding because it was the author's surname, Margot Fielding, a name pieced together from a book she didn't remember whether she had read or not. Paige Greer found her at the hospital. Paige was 40 years old then, a widow, the owner of a small bakery in Somerville, and she came to UMass Memorial every Saturday to volunteer by reading books to long-stay patients. Paige met Margot in the recovery room and asked if she wanted someone to read to her. Margot said no, but asked whether Paige knew how to bake, because she had just dreamed of the smell of flour and had woken craving something she couldn't name. Paige said, "I have a bakery," and that was enough. Paige took Margot back to Somerville, let her stay temporarily in the room above the bakery, taught her how to knead dough, bake bread, work the register, and gave her a life that was small but real. 5 years later, Margot was still there. She remembered nothing before the night on Route 9, but she had fragments. They came in dreams or suddenly during the day, without warning, without explanation. Like broken pieces of pottery someone had slipped into her pocket when she didn't know what vase they belonged to. The smell of oak. That smell came whenever she touched the surface of a wooden table, and it carried with it a warmth she couldn't attach to any specific memory, but knew for certain belonged to a place she had once called home. The sound of a piano. Not a particular song, only the sound of fingers touching keys, again and again, as though someone were practicing a passage they hadn't learned by heart yet. A hand on her back. A large, warm hand placed between her shoulder blades. Not gripping, not pushing, only resting there. And the safety it brought was so powerful that every time Margot remembered it, she had to sit down because her knees weakened. And the image of a newborn baby, eyes wide open, looking up, looking straight at her. And she knew that baby wasn't looking at her as though looking at a stranger, but as though looking at the most important person in the world. Whenever that image came, Margot took out her sketchbook and drew. She drew the eyes, drew the tiny hands, drew the blurred shape of the face, but she could never draw the whole face. Every time she tried to add more, the details dissolved like smoke, and she had to stop again, the pencil suspended above the paper, her hand trembling slightly because she was trying to hold on to something her brain refused to give back. Every morning, before leaving the studio, she stood in front of the small bathroom mirror and looked at herself for a very long time. Not the ordinary way people look in a mirror, but the way a person looks when trying to recognize the face reflected in front of her, trying to find in those features a clue, a signal, anything that might tell her who she had been before she became Margot Fielding, bakery employee, Elm Street, Somerville. Paige saw her do it once, standing in the doorway of the bakery bathroom, when Margot didn't know someone was watching. "One day, you'll remember," Paige said softly, in the voice of someone who had said that sentence many times and still believed it each time she said it. Margot looked at Paige through the mirror. "I don't know whether I want to remember or whether I'm more afraid of remembering." She said it in a very ordinary voice, a voice like she was talking about the weather, but Paige knew it wasn't an ordinary thing to say, because Margot's eyes as she said it looked like the eyes of someone standing before a closed door, not knowing whether what waited behind that door was home or an abyss. Everett drove the black Escalade to Somerville at 6 in the morning on Tuesday, 2 days after receiving the verification result. He parked across the street from Greer's bakery, turned off the engine, and sat there. The bodyguard in the front passenger seat didn't ask anything, because he was paid not to ask anything. The bakery was smaller than Everett had imagined. A white-painted storefront, a glass door, a hand-lettered wooden sign that read Greer's, with a wheat stalk drawn in the corner. The kind of sign someone had painted by hand instead of ordering, and it looked like every small bakery in every middle-class neighborhood outside Boston. Nothing special. Nothing that should have made a man like Everett Crane drive 12 miles here at 6 in the morning, unless the woman behind that glass door was the wife he had buried 5 years earlier. She was standing behind the counter. Her hair was shorter than in the photograph from the report, much shorter than it had been in the old days when she wore it past her shoulders, and Everett used to bury his face in it in the mornings before getting out of bed. She wore a white t-shirt, a canvas apron dusted with flour, and she was smiling at a customer standing at the counter. A small, polite smile, the kind of smile a server gives a regular customer, not the smile Everett remembered. That smile had been wider, warmer, the smile she gave him when he said something ridiculous at dinner, but it was still her. Still the way she tilted her head when listening to someone speak. Still the way she lifted her right hand to brush her hair behind her ear, even though her hair was now short enough that it didn't need brushing back. Still her. Everett sat in the car for 47 minutes. He knew exactly because he looked at the clock when he parked, and looked at it again when he started the engine to leave, and the distance between those two glances was 47 minutes, in which he did nothing but sit there and watch his wife live a life without him in it. He didn't go inside. Not because he didn't want to, but because he was afraid. And Everett Crane wasn't the kind of man who easily admitted he feared anything, yet he sat inside a $200,000 armored vehicle and was afraid to step into a bakery, because if he went in and she looked at him, looked straight into his face with the eyes he had looked into every day of their marriage, and those eyes were empty, unknowing, holding nothing, looking at him as though he were a stranger walking in to buy coffee. He didn't know what would become of him. For 5 years, he had lived with her death. For 5 years, he had become what he became because he had lost her. And now she was alive. She was here. She was one street and one glass door away from him. But she wouldn't know any of that. She would look at him and see a strange man in an expensive suit. Not her husband, not the father of her daughter, not the man who had once lain beside her every night, listening to her breathe in her sleep, and feeling that it was the only sound that made the world mean anything. He started the engine, left, drove back to Beacon Hill in silence, the bodyguard still asking nothing. When Everett walked into the house, Lenny was sitting on the stairs, still in her pajamas, hair messy, eyes awake as though she hadn't slept at all. She looked at her father. "Did you go see Mommy?" "Yeah." "Does Mommy remember you?" Silence. Lenny understood that silence better than any answer. She sat still for a while, her feet swinging over the stair, thinking, then said in a very practical voice, the voice of an 8-year-old child solving a math problem rather than talking about her mother's amnesia. "Then you gotta make her like you again. Like a normal person. You know, say hi, buy coffee, don't be scary." Everett looked at his daughter. "I run this city, Lenny." "Yeah, but you can't even bring flowers without looking like you're threatening someone. So maybe start smaller." Everett didn't answer. He stood at the foot of the stairs, looking at his 8-year-old daughter sitting on the 3rd step from the bottom, with eyes exactly like her mother's, and a voice exactly like her mother's, when she said plainly what no one else dared to say, and he realized that among all the things Lenny had fixed for him over the past few weeks, the restaurant, the charities, the books, the thing she was trying to fix now was the hardest thing of all. Not the empire. Him. The next day, Everett returned to Greer's bakery, and the day after that. And the day after that. He came at 6 o'clock in the morning, exactly when the shop opened, wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit, a Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, polished Oxford shoes, looking like a man who had stepped off the cover of a financial magazine and somehow wandered into a suburban bakery. 2 bodyguards parked the black Escalade across the street, didn't come in, and sat in the car drinking coffee bought from the convenience store on the corner because Everett had forbidden them from entering the bakery. He ordered black coffee, sat at the corner table by the window, and pretended to read the news on his phone while his eyes never left Margot behind the counter. On the 3rd day, Margot asked his name because she was the kind of person who remembered regular customers, and he had become the fastest regular customer in the history of the shop. "Everett," he said. "What do you do, Everett?" He hesitated for exactly half a second. Long enough that Frank Whitmore, if he had been there, would have had to close his eyes and worry, then said, "Consulting." Margot looked through the glass door at the 2 large men sitting in the black SUV parked across the street, then looked back at Everett with the eyes he knew better than anyone else in the world, the eyes of a woman who always assessed a situation before reacting. Must be some serious consulting. He didn't answer. She poured him more coffee without asking whether he wanted more, and he realized that was her habit. Celeste used to do the same thing, pouring him more coffee without asking, because she always knew he wanted more before he knew it himself. Every evening when he came home, Lenny was waiting to coach him. She sat on the sofa, legs folded beneath her, a notebook on her lap, and asked her father about his progress with the seriousness of an executive listening to a quarterly report. "Did you talk to Mommy?" "Yes." "About what?" "Coffee." "Coffee." She asked whether I wanted more sugar. I said no. "Daddy, that's not talking. That's ordering a drink." On the 5th day, Lenny watched her father getting ready to leave the house at 5:45 in the morning. Gray suit, tie, pocket square, looking like he was going to sign a corporate acquisition instead of going to a bakery for coffee, and said, "Daddy, you look like you're about to acquire the building." Everett fastened the button of his suit jacket. "I already acquired the building." Lenny looked at her father with the expression Dolores would later describe as the exact look her mother had when she was about to say something no one wanted to hear. "Daddy, you bought the whole bakery building? That's how I show interest. That's how you show scary. Those are different things." In the second week, Everett brought flowers, a bouquet of tulips, because he remembered Celeste loved tulips, bought from the flower shop on Beacon Street at 5 o'clock in the morning, carefully wrapped in craft paper. He placed them on the counter in front of Margot. Margot looked at the flowers, looked at him, and said very gently but very clearly, "I don't take flowers from customers. It's sweet, but no." He took the bouquet back, walked out the door, got into the car, and drove home. That evening, Frank came to the house to sign papers and found Everett sitting in the study, the tulips still on the desk, no liquor poured, wearing the face of a man who had just been punched straight in the mouth by reality. "My wife rejected my flowers, Frank. My wife rejected my flowers. Do you understand how that sentence shouldn't exist?" Frank didn't answer because there was no answer suitable for this situation in any law book or life book he had ever read. But over the next few days, something changed. Not something large, not something dramatic, but something real. Margot began to grow used to Everett, not because of the flowers or the suits or the expensive car across the street, but because of the way he asked about her. He didn't ask, "How are you?" like every other customer. He asked, "Did you sleep last night?" The first time she heard that question, she stopped wiping the counter and looked at him, her head tilted slightly, because no one had ever asked her that before. No one had cared enough to ask that, and that question was truer than any, "How are you?" Because Margot Fielding couldn't sleep most nights. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to hold on to the fragments of memory her brain gave and took back at the same time. And having someone ask exactly the right question on exactly that morning made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in 5 years. "No," she said. "I rarely sleep." "Me too," he said, and that was their first real conversation. After that came other conversations, short ones, just a few minutes between the moment she poured his coffee and the moment the next customer came in. But real, the kind of real Margot didn't have with many people, because she had no past to share, so she wasn't used to opening up. But with Everett, she did open up, because he didn't ask about the past. He asked about the present, about sleep, about the book she was reading, about the changing season, and she felt comfortable with that, in a way she couldn't explain. Then came that morning, the morning Margot stood behind the counter, coffee pot in hand, and said to Everett in an ordinary voice, the voice of someone recounting an unimportant dream, "I had such a strange dream last night, the smell of oak, very clear, and a hand on my back. I don't know whose hand it was, but it was warm, and I felt safe. I always dream about it, but last night it was clearer than every other time." Everett set his coffee cup down, slowly, very slowly. The oak desk in his house, the desk he had overturned in his rage and then placed back exactly where it belonged, the desk Celeste used to sit on every evening while he worked, and he would place his hand on her back, between her shoulder blades, not gripping, not pushing, only resting there. That hand was his. That smell of oak was his desk. She was dreaming about him without knowing it was him. "That hand," he said, his voice so steady that even he was surprised he could hold it there. "What did it feel like?" Margot thought for a moment, like someone was saying, "I'm here," without having to open their mouth. Everett nodded, finished his coffee, left money on the counter, said, "See you tomorrow," in an ordinary voice, walked out the door, got into the car, closed the car door, and for the first time in 5 years, Everett Crane cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, both hands on the steering wheel, his forehead resting against the backs of his hands, his shoulders trembling faintly, and tears falling onto the thighs of the $4,000 Tom Ford suit pants he didn't bother to wipe. The bodyguard in the front seat stared straight through the windshield and pretended not to see anything, because there are things even a man paid to observe everything knows he must pretend not to see. While every morning Everett sat in the bakery drinking coffee with his wife, without her knowing he was her husband, every night he sat in the study in Beacon Hill and dug. He dug with the cold patience of a man who had built an empire from ashes, the kind of patience he used when hunting enemies. Only this time the enemy carried the Crane name. He started with the lab, Biogenesis Labs in Quincy, where the DNA sample from the car explosion had been tested. Frank helped him obtain the original records, without going through Penn. And when the records came back, everything began to grow clearer in a way Everett wished it hadn't. Biogenesis Labs had been founded 3 years before the explosion by a man named Gerald Fisk. Gerald Fisk had once been an accountant for the Crane organization, before leaving and opening the lab with capital that, according to the records, came from a shell company named Harbor Capital Partners, which Penn had set up right around the time he began draining the restaurant funds. Harbor Capital Partners was registered in Delaware by a lawyer Frank recognized immediately, because he himself had introduced that lawyer to Penn 3 years earlier. Penn had built the lab before he ever needed to use it, not because he had known in advance that he would need to fake a DNA result, but because Penn was the kind of man who always prepared an exit route before he began stealing, and having a lab in his hands was an exit route. The second DNA sample, the one the original report had requested in order to confirm the result because the first sample had been damaged by heat, had never been taken. Penn told Frank he had gone to the lab himself to check, that the sample matched, that the file could be closed. Frank believed him because Penn was Everett's younger brother, blood, the last person anyone in the organization would suspect. But the second sample didn't exist. It had never existed. Everett dug further. Explosives. The Boston police classified the car explosion as a mechanical equipment accident because that was how police classified things when they didn't have enough evidence or didn't want to dig too deeply into the territory of a man they knew better than to provoke. But Everett had people inside the police department, and when he asked for the bomb squad's original file, the technical report stated clearly, chemical traces consistent with a variant of C4 plastic explosive, the kind used in military and paramilitary settings, not the kind easily bought on the civilian market. The Crane organization used a C4 variant in evidence destruction operations at the harbor, a process only 3 people knew how to access from storage: Everett, Penn, and a foot soldier named Briggs, whom Penn directly managed. Briggs died in a motorcycle accident 6 months after Celeste's car exploded. Accident. Everett now looked at that word entirely differently. The truth came together like this. Celeste Crane had pursued her accounting passion at Boston University, and had helped Everett manage the restaurant books since Lenny was 1 year old. She worked at home, on the oak desk, at night, while Lenny slept, and she was good enough to see what Frank hadn't seen, or hadn't wanted to see, or hadn't thought needed to be found. A cash flow that didn't match, about $70,000 a month, draining out of the system through a chain of small transactions, disguised as equipment maintenance expenses for the restaurants. $70,000 a month. For nearly 2 years before the explosion. Nearly $7 million in total, transferred into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands that Penn had opened under the name of another ghost company. Celeste discovered it. She hadn't had time to tell Everett. She might have told Penn first, asked Penn to explain, because she trusted Penn. Everyone trusted Penn. Penn was her husband's younger brother, her daughter's uncle, the man who sat at dinner with her family every week. And Penn, when he realized Celeste had seen it, decided that $4 million and his own freedom mattered more than his sister-in-law's life. The car exploded 2 days later. Penn didn't know Celeste had survived. When the DNA sample came back, and the result was inconclusive, Penn saw an opportunity to close the file forever. He told Frank the sample matched. Frank believed him. Everett, drowning in grief, with no reason to suspect his own brother, agreed to close the file, because opening it again only meant opening more pain. And Celeste, the 23-year-old girl who had once sat on the oak desk reading ledgers for her husband, was lying in a hospital in Worcester with a fractured skull and an empty mind, not knowing who she was, not knowing she had a husband, a child, a life, while her husband stood before her grave and tried to find a way to keep living. Everett knew all of this at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday night, sitting in the study, every piece of evidence spread across the oak desk where she had once sat, and he wanted to kill Penn. Not wanted in a metaphorical way, wanted in the way that he had already picked up the phone and nearly called someone to handle it that very night, because that was how Everett Crane had solved problems for the past 5 years. Fast violence, clean violence, finished. But he put the phone down, because Lenny was asleep upstairs, And if he killed Penn, he would become again the thing he had been for the past 5 years. The thing Celeste, if she ever remembered, wouldn't recognize. Or worse, would recognize and wouldn't want to come back to. He called Frank at 3 a.m, the second time that month Frank had been woken in the middle of the night. And when Frank arrived, Everett pushed all the evidence across the table and said, "Give me a reason not to kill him." Frank sat down, read everything, stayed silent for a very long time, then said in the exhausted voice of a man who had served this family too long and seen too much, "There are 2 ways. Kill Penn, quickly, be done with it, and live with it the way you've lived with everything else, by burying it and pretending it isn't eating you from the inside. Or bury Penn with evidence, hand him over to the FBI, let the system handle it, slower, more painful, but Lenny doesn't lose anyone else. The second way isn't your way, but it's the way Lenny's father should choose." Everett looked at Frank. Then he looked at the photograph of Lenny on the bookshelf, the photograph of her at 5 years old, laughing, the only photograph in the room he hadn't turned face down after Celeste died. And he chose the second way. Penn wasn't stupid. Penn had survived inside the Crane organization not because he was Everett's younger brother, but because he knew how to read people, knew when someone was hiding something, knew when the flow of power was shifting even by a single millimeter. And Penn realized Everett was changing. Not in any large way, not through declarations or different orders, but through small things. Everett left earlier every morning, came home later, but not because of harbor business, and there was something in his eyes Penn hadn't seen in 5 years. Not hope, not quite that, but the absence of the familiar emptiness, as though someone had lit a small lamp inside a room Penn had believed had gone dark forever. Penn had Everett followed. A foot soldier named Mercer, reliable and quiet, was given a simple task. Follow the black Escalade every morning and report back. Mercer reported that Everett went to a bakery in Somerville called Greer's Bakery, sat there for 45 minutes to an hour, drank coffee, and talked to a female employee named Margot. On the 3rd day, Mercer sent a photo taken from across the street, a photo of Margot standing behind the counter. Penn opened the photo on his phone at 9 o'clock at night in his apartment in the Seaport district, and his world stopped. He zoomed in, looked at the face, the line of the jaw, the way the woman tilted her head, the mole on her neck, and Penn Crane, 34 years old, the man who had spent 5 years believing the greatest secret of his life was safely buried 6 feet underground in Mount Hope Cemetery, realized that secret was standing behind the counter of a bakery 15 minutes from his apartment and pouring coffee for his brother. Penn panicked. Not the kind of panic that loses control, but the kind of panic that belongs to an intelligent man who realizes every exit is closing at once and has to find a new one before the final door slams shut. He called Neil Phelan. Phelan, 50 years old, the boss of South Boston, the man who had wanted to swallow Crane's harbor territory for a decade but had never been strong enough to try, listened to Penn's offer over the phone at 11 o'clock at night, full control of the shipping route through the harbor, in exchange for Phelan protecting Penn from Everett when everything broke open, and helping Penn leave Boston safely with the money in his offshore account. Phelan agreed, not because he trusted Penn, but because the harbor territory was worth that nod. But before running, Penn did one thing he would later realize was the greatest mistake of his life. He went to Greer's Bakery. He wanted to confirm with his own eyes that Margot was truly Celeste, and he wanted to know what she remembered. He walked into the bakery at 10 o'clock in the morning, dressed casually, wearing an easy smile, ordered a croissant and a latte. And when Margot handed them over, he said, "Thank you. I feel like I know you from somewhere. I'm Penn, an old friend." Margot looked at him. She didn't recognize the face, didn't recognize the name, but something in her body reacted, something her brain couldn't explain but her nervous system understood very clearly, the way human beings know to avoid fire before they understand what fire is. That evening, when Paige asked how the day had gone, Margot said, "A man came in today, said he was an old friend. I don't remember him, but..." She stopped, looked at her hands. "My hands shook when he stood near me. I don't know why." Paige looked at Margot and said nothing, but that night she locked the bakery door more carefully than usual. The next morning, Margot told Everett about the old friend named Penn, who had come to the bakery the day before. She told him in an ordinary voice, not knowing why Everett suddenly set his coffee cup down harder than usual, not knowing why his eyes changed, shifting from the warmth she had grown used to over the past few weeks into something colder, harder, something she had never seen before, something that frightened her for a moment even though she didn't understand why. Everett left the bakery right after that. He called Frank on the way home. Penn came to the bakery. He knows. Frank was silent for 3 seconds, then said, "When?" "Tonight." That night, in the basement office of Crane's on Newbury, the restaurant Lenny had turned into a real restaurant with 4 pages written in pencil. Everett sat waiting for Penn. No bodyguards. No Frank. 2 brothers. Penn came because Everett had called, and Penn came because he still didn't know how much Everett knew, and his survival instinct told him that not showing up would be a confession. The basement room was small, brick walls, 1 table, 2 chairs, 1 ceiling light. Everett sat on one side. Penn sat down across from him. Silence. Then Everett spoke, his voice low, calm. The kind of calm everyone in the organization knew wasn't calm at all. But the final control before everything broke open. That night, 5 years ago. "Did you kill my wife? Or did you kill your sister-in-law?" Penn didn't deny it. Maybe because he knew there was nothing left to deny. Or maybe because Penn had always been the kind of man who would rather face something than kneel. And he said, "You don't understand. She was going to destroy everything. She saw the money. She was going to tell you, and you would have killed me. Or she would have gone to the police, and all of us would have gone to prison. I did it for the empire, for this family. You did it because of the $4 million you stole. You killed her because you stole and got caught. Don't ever dress cowardice in loyalty." Penn looked at his brother. And in Penn's eyes then, there was something Everett recognized. It wasn't remorse. Penn didn't know remorse. It was fear, the pure fear of an animal that knows it has been cornered. "Are you going to kill me?" "No. I'm going to bury you with paperwork." 3 hours later, Frank Whitmore sent an anonymous evidence package to the FBI's Boston office at One Center Plaza. Offshore account records, transfer documents, the connection between Penn Crane and Biogenesis Labs, and the recording of the conversation between Penn and Neil Phelan that Everett had had someone record from the day he learned Penn had contacted Phelan. The FBI came to Penn's apartment in the Seaport District at 6 o'clock the next morning. Penn was arrested on 14 federal charges, including embezzlement, financial fraud, and conspiracy. Neil Phelan, having lost his inside ally and been exposed through the recording, fell into the federal crosshairs within 48 hours. The Crane empire lost its second in command, lost part of its financial arm, and shook. But it still stood. And Everett Crane, the man who had solved every problem with violence for the past 10 years, solved this one for the first time with evidence, with the law, by letting the system do its work. Not because he suddenly believed in the law, but because an 8-year-old child with a notebook and a set of colored pencils had shown him, through 4 pages of Pusheen cat paper, that there was another way besides destruction. 2 days after Penn was arrested, when the noise had settled, when Frank had finished handling the calls from federal lawyers, and when the Crane organization had stopped shaking enough for Everett to breathe, he drove to Greer's Bakery at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, an hour when he had never come before, because he always came in the morning. And Margot looked at him as he walked in with mild surprise, because when a regular morning customer suddenly appeared in the afternoon, it meant something was different from usual. The bakery was about to close. Paige was cleaning up in the back. Only one customer remained, sitting in the corner and finishing his tea before standing up to leave. Everett waited until that customer walked out the door. Then he sat down on the chair across from the counter, the place where he sat every morning drinking coffee, and pretending he was only an ordinary customer who loved black coffee. And he looked at Margot, and he spoke. No preparation, no rehearsal. He simply spoke because he had held it in for too long, and because after what had happened with Penn, he understood that the truth, when hidden long enough, became something that destroyed everything around it, and he had already let enough things be destroyed. "Your real name is Celeste. You have a daughter named Lenny. She's 8 years old, and I'm your husband." Margot stopped wiping the counter. She looked at him, said nothing. Her eyes changed, moving from surprise to confusion to something that looked like fear but wasn't exactly fear, closer to the feeling of a person standing on ground that suddenly no longer felt solid. "You're insane." "I'm not insane. Get out of my shop. Just listen to me. Get out. Now. Right now." Her voice trembled, but her eyes did not. Her eyes looked straight at him with a hardness Everett recognized, because Celeste had looked at him with those same eyes every time she disagreed with him and had no intention of yielding. Paige heard Margot's voice, rising higher than normal, stepped out from the back, looked at Everett with the eyes of someone ready to call the police, and Everett knew he had to leave. He stood, but before he walked out the door, he placed two things on the counter. A wedding photograph, taken 6 years earlier. Everett in a gray suit, Celeste in a simple white dress, both of them standing in front of Boston City Hall, smiling, and anyone who looked at that photograph would see that the woman in the picture and the woman standing behind the counter of this bakery were the same person, even with different hair, even with the years between them, and a letter, handwritten, childish handwriting, paper with Pusheen in the corner. Lenny had written that letter the night before, sitting at her desk, Dolores beside her, and she wrote very slowly, more carefully than usual, because this wasn't a business proposal or a restaurant diagram. This was the most important thing she had ever written. Dear Mommy, my name is Lenny. I'm 8. I like numbers and foxes. I have your eyes. Everybody says that. I don't remember you because I was 3 when you went away, but I kept your picture next to my bed every night, and sometimes I talk to it when Dolores isn't looking. Daddy says you don't remember us either, so I guess we're the same. Please come home. I'll show you my room and my notebooks and the fox den I found on Google Maps near our house. Love, Lenny. Everett placed those two things on the counter, said nothing more, and walked out the door. That night, in the studio on Elm Street, Margot Fielding sat on the bed holding the wedding photograph in one hand and the letter in the other. She read the letter 4 times. Each time she read it, her finger moved over the child's handwriting, over the line, I have your eyes, over the line, please come home. And she felt something inside her chest crack, not break, not yet, but crack, the way ice cracks before it melts. She slept with the letter on her pillow, and she dreamed, more clearly than any night in the past 5 years. The smell of oak, but this time she saw the table too, large and heavy, set in a room with bookshelves. The sound of piano, but this time she saw the fingers, her fingers, moving over the keys, playing a passage of Chopin she didn't know she knew. The hand on her back, but this time she saw the arm, then the shoulder, then a face, blurred but present, the line of a jaw, dark eyes, and she knew that face. She didn't remember it, she knew it. And crying, the cry of a newborn baby, and for the first time, she looked down and saw the baby, tiny, flushed red, eyes wide open, looking up at her, and she heard her own voice say, Lenny. She woke at 3 o'clock in the morning, drenched in sweat, both hands gripping the letter, and called the phone number Everett had left on the back of the wedding photograph. He answered on the first second, as though he hadn't slept, as though he had been sitting there holding the phone and waiting. I want to meet her. When? Tomorrow morning, at the bakery, somewhere public. The next morning, Lenny came to Greer's bakery with Dolores. She wore a navy blue dress, her hair neatly braided by Dolores, her black shoes polished, and she carried her notebook because Lenny carried her notebook everywhere. She stood in front of the bakery's glass door, looked inside, and saw Margot standing behind the counter, looking out, looking at her. Lenny stepped in. Dolores followed behind, her eyes already red before she even set foot inside the shop. Paige stood in the corner of the kitchen, having been told in advance by Margot, saying nothing, only standing there like a guard for a moment she knew didn't belong to her, but wanted to remain near the room in case she was needed. Lenny walked straight to the counter, stood there, looked up at Margot, and Margot looked down at the little girl, looked at those eyes, the eyes she had seen in the mirror every morning without knowing why they seemed to belong to someone else, and now she knew who they belonged to. They belonged to the child standing in front of her. Hi, I'm Lenny. I'm 8. I like numbers and foxes and I have your eyes. Her voice was calm, straight, clear. The voice she had practiced in her head all through the previous night because she wanted to say it correctly, wanted the first sentence she said to her mother to be perfect. But after that sentence ended, after the final syllable left her lips, Lenny Crane, the 8-year-old child who had discovered that her father was laundering money and had written a proposal to fix it in pencil, the child who had found out her mother was alive with an iPad and a mathematical code, the child who had said, Daddy breaks things when he's scared, with the calm of an adult, the child who hadn't cried once through this entire story because she had built around herself a wall exactly like the wall her father had built. That wall broke. Tears ran down. No noise, no sobbing, no crying sound. only tears sliding over a face that still tried to stay calm, the way her father had cried in the car the week before, tears falling while the face barely moved, and that was the most heartbreaking thing anyone in that small bakery had ever seen. Because a child crying without allowing herself to cry hurts more than any scream. Margot knelt. She didn't think, didn't decide. Her knees bent as though her body had done it on its own before her mind had time to give the order. And she knelt at the child's eye level, and she embraced Lenny. Her arms wrapped around the little girl's back and she held her, and her hands knew how to hold this child, knew to place one hand on her back and one hand on her head, knew to pull her into her chest at the exact right angle. And that wasn't memory. It was something deeper than memory, something the body keeps when the mind gives up. Then she whispered. Not because she remembered, but because she knew. You smell like flour. Did you eat bread today? Lenny nodded in her arms, her hair brushing Margot's chin, and Margot felt that nod inside her chest. Dolores, standing 3 steps away, cried without making a sound, both hands covering her mouth, because that was exactly the question Celeste used to ask Lenny every time she picked her up when she was little, every time Lenny had just finished eating, and the smell of flour still clung to her clothes, and Celeste always asked it in a whisper, the voice only mother and child could hear, a voice no one else in the world knew except Dolores, because she had stood in the kitchen doorway and watched every time. Paige stood in the corner of the kitchen, one hand gripping the doorframe, her eyes wet, not understanding why that question made Dolores cry, but understanding that she was witnessing something larger than anything she had ever seen in this small bakery. Margot didn't remember everything. She still didn't remember. But her hands, when they held Lenny, knew how to hold this child. The body remembered before the mind. After that morning at the bakery, Margot didn't move back into the Beacon Hill house right away. She needed time, and no one forced her. Not Everett, not Dolores, not even Lenny. Because even though the little girl wanted her mother home more than anything in the world, she also understood, in the way this 8-year-old child understood everything, that forcing a person who remembered nothing to return to a place she didn't remember would only make her more afraid, not make her remember more. So they met slowly. The first time was at the bakery, where Lenny sat eating toast and told Margot about school, about Windsor School, about the math teacher Lenny liked because she doesn't get annoyed when I finish the problems before the rest of the class, about the notebook she carried everywhere, about Chef Glenn at the Newbury restaurant, whose garlic bread is better now, but still not perfect. Margot sat listening and watching the little girl speak, watching the way she waved her hands when explaining a complicated idea, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about numbers, and she didn't remember, but she recognized it. In the way people recognize themselves in a mirror even when they don't remember what they look like, because this child looked so much like her that it hurt. The second time was at Boston Common, on a bench beside the duck pond. Dolores came along but sat farther away to give mother and daughter space. Lenny brought her iPad and showed Margot the fox den she had found on Google Maps near the house. I haven't gone there because Dolores won't let me go into the woods by myself, but I know it's there, and Margot laughed. The first real laugh she had given beside Lenny, and when she laughed, Lenny stopped speaking halfway through and looked at her with those eyes that were exactly like hers, and said very softly, "Daddy says Mommy laughs like that." The memories came back slowly, not like in movies, not like a switch being turned on, but like water seeping through cloth, drop by drop, impossible to control, impossible to predict. One afternoon, when Margot hugged Lenny goodbye at the bakery, she smelled children's body wash in the girl's hair, the kind Dolores still bought because Lenny liked it even though she was 8 years old, and that scent pulled with it an image. Margot's hands bathing a very small baby in a plastic tub, warm water, soap bubbles, and the baby leaning her head back and laughing without making a sound. Margot had to sit down because her knees couldn't hold her. One night, she sat in the studio, and her fingers tapped on the tabletop in a melody, tapping it again and again. And she realized it was Chopin, Nocturne Opus 9, number 2, and she didn't know why she knew that piece, but her fingers knew. They remembered the placement of the keys even though she didn't remember knowing how to play piano. And the hand on her back, now she knew whose hand it was. She didn't remember with memory, but she knew by the way her body reacted every time Everett stood near her, the way her shoulders loosened on their own, the way her breathing slowed, as though her body was saying he is safe, before her mind had time to ask why. A few days later, She met Everett again at the bakery one afternoon, after closing time, with Paige in the back, and this time she didn't throw him out. She sat across from him and said, directly, without circling around it, "So you're telling me I married a criminal?" "Yes." Silence. "Should I run? You should do whatever you want. I don't decide for anyone anymore." She looked at him for a very long time, looked into the eyes she had seen in dreams, at the face her mind had refused to give back to her for 5 years, but that was now sitting in front of her in flesh and bone. And she didn't remember loving him, but she remembered feeling safe near him, and maybe, for now, that was enough. 2 weeks later, Margot came to the Beacon Hill house. Lenny led her through every room, explaining every corner. "This is the living room. This is where Daddy usually sits drinking alone at 3 in the morning, but he's been doing it less since I started cleaning things up," while Dolores walked behind them, shaking her head because cleaning things up was not a phrase an 8-year-old child should use so naturally. Then they reached the kitchen. Margot stepped inside and stopped. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, her eyes moving slowly around the room, looking at the granite counter, looking at the window overlooking the back garden, looking at the oak cabinet in the corner that someone had refinished, but kept in its old shape, and she drew in a deep breath, then said in a very soft voice, almost a whisper, "This kitchen smells like oak and old flour." Everett stood in the kitchen doorway behind her, and when she said that, he had to turn his face away, because he didn't want her to see his face then. Not because he was crying. He wasn't crying, but because what was on his face in that moment was something he didn't know how to hide. Something between pain and relief, between loss and return, between 5 years of burial and a 7-word sentence from the mouth of the woman he had believed he had lost forever. Lenny stood at the foot of the stairs, looking into the kitchen, and whispered to Dolores, so softly only the two of them could hear, "Mommy is remembering the kitchen." Dolores placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, held it gently, and said, "Your mother is remembering home." Celeste moved back into the Beacon Hill house 1 week later. Not because she remembered everything. She still didn't remember everything. Maybe she never would. But Lenny asked, "Do you want to be here with me?" And that question, from the child with her eyes and her habit of falling into silence when she thought, and her way of loving through action instead of words, that question didn't need memory to answer. And the house, the kitchen smelling of oak and old flour, the living room with the piano her fingers knew how to play, the staircase, her feet climbed without looking, because her body remembered how many steps there were. That house felt right in a way Margot Fielding, the Elm Street studio, the 3:45 in the morning alarm, never had. Not right because she remembered. Right because she belonged. 6 months later, Celeste Crane sat in a neurology clinic at Massachusetts General Hospital, across from the specialist Everett, had scheduled an appointment with the month before, and listened as the doctor said, gently but honestly, that her memory might return in small pieces over time, or it might never return completely, that the human brain was something medicine understood a great deal about, but still not enough, and that she should prepare herself for the possibility of living with permanent blank spaces. Everett sat beside her, listening, saying nothing. Lenny wasn't there because she was at school, but that night she asked Dolores, "What did the doctor say?" And Dolores said, "The doctor said your mother might not remember everything." And Lenny nodded, then said, "That's okay. I'll tell Mommy the things she forgets. I'm very good at remembering." Celeste accepted that more quickly than Everett did. She had lived 5 years without a past, and she had learned that you didn't need to remember everything to know where you belonged. She knew Lenny was her daughter not because she remembered the day the child was born, but because every time she held Lenny, her hands knew where to go. She knew Everett was her husband, not because she remembered the wedding, but because every time he stood near her, her shoulders loosened on their own and her breathing slowed. She knew the Beacon Hill house was her home not because she remembered living there, but because the kitchen smelled of oak and old flour, and that smell felt right in a way no other place ever had. She didn't need to remember in order to know, and for Celeste, that was enough. Lenny, meanwhile, did not stop. She had cleaned up the Newberry restaurant, had redirected the donations to Boston Children's Hospital, and now, 6 months after her mother came home, she had a new project. She called it Phase 3, a PowerPoint presentation, 17 slides, with Dolores helping with the formatting because Lenny hadn't mastered animations yet, and Frank reviewing the legal section because, after all, this involved millions of dollars. And when an 8-year-old child presented on harbor logistics, At least one lawyer should probably read it first. The content: moving the entire Boston Harbor shipping division from illegal channels into lawful logistics, partnering with federally licensed transportation companies, and gradually eliminating the routes the Crane organization had been using to move contraband. Lenny presented it to Everett in the study one Saturday evening, standing in front of an open laptop, using a laser pointer she had taken from Frank's drawer, and speaking in the most serious voice a third-grade child could possibly have. Slide 1, Overview. Slide 2, Current costs versus legal costs. Slide 3, This is Grandma. Grandma? I accidentally left in the slide with Grandma's picture from my school presentation last week. Skip that slide. Slide 4. Everett listened to all 17 slides, 16 slides about logistics, and 1 slide about Grandma. Then looked at Frank, who was sitting in the corner of the room. I'm being restructured by a third grader, Frank. Frank nodded. And she's better at it than both of us. The Crane empire began to change. Slowly, painfully, imperfectly. The Newberry restaurant made a real profit with real money after 4 months. Glenn had fixed the garlic bread according to Lenny's feedback, and now it was the best-selling item on the menu. 2 more restaurants were in the process of being converted. The Boston Children's Hospital sponsorship program was covered by the local press, and Everett had to stand for photographs, with the hospital board wearing an expression Frank described as looking like he was being held hostage, but politely. There were still dark corners. There were still nights when Everett had to handle things he couldn't tell his wife and daughter about. There were still midnight calls, meetings in windowless rooms, and decisions daylight wasn't allowed to touch. The empire did not become a lawful corporation overnight, but its direction had changed. Not because Everett Crane had suddenly become a good man, but because he had chosen to become the father Lenny believed he was, and the husband Celeste deserved, and those 2 choices, every day, pulled him farther away from the man he had been during those 5 years of drinking alone at 3 o'clock in the morning and waiting for everything to collapse. 5 o'clock in the morning, the kitchen of the Beacon Hill house. Celeste stood at the counter, her hair still loose, bare feet on the wooden floor, baking sourdough because the habit of waking early from the bakery hadn't left her, and she didn't want it to leave because it was the part of Margot Fielding she had carried home into Celeste Crane, the part she chose to keep. The smell of flour and the smell of oak from the cabinet in the corner of the kitchen mingled in the air. Lenny sat at the kitchen table, her feet not touching the floor, reading the Wall Street Journal because she said she needed to stay current on the logistics market to complete Phase 3. And Dolores had long since stopped trying to keep her from reading financial newspapers. Everett walked into the kitchen. His shirt wasn't fully buttoned. His hair wasn't combed. His eyes were still a little swollen from going to bed late, but he had slept. He had been sleeping these past few months. Not every night, but more than before. And sleep had returned to him slowly, in the same way memory had returned to Celeste. In pieces, imperfectly, but truly. Celeste looked at him, then looked at the cup of coffee she had already made and placed in the spot where he always sat, then looked back at him. You look different in the morning, less like someone who runs a city, more like someone who lives in a house. Everett sat down, drank his coffee. Lenny turned the page of the newspaper without looking up. Dolores passed by the kitchen door, looked in, saw the 3 of them in the early morning kitchen, and said nothing. She only kept walking, but she smiled, the kind of smile she had forgotten she still knew how to make. And Everett Crane, sitting in the kitchen that smelled of oak and flour, in the gray dawn light of Boston filtering through the window, hot coffee in his hand, his wife at the counter, his daughter at the table, felt something he had forgotten how to name. Not happiness, something steadier than that. Something that did not depend on everything being right, on the empire staying upright, on memory returning completely, on the past being forgiven. Something that only needed 3 people in a kitchen at 5 o'clock in the morning, hot coffee, bread baking, and the simple truth that they were here, together, and none of them intended to go anywhere. The empire was still the empire. The city still lay beneath his feet. The work was still hard, and the nights were still long, and there were things daylight wasn't allowed to know. But the man who walked into that kitchen every morning now walked in differently, not as someone waiting for collapse, but as someone who had chosen, somewhere along the way, to bet on it instead of destroying it. She had done that. Both of them had. The woman with no memory had chosen to stay even though she didn't remember why this place was home. And the 8-year-old child with the notebook and the colored pencils had looked into her father's dark empire and, instead of being afraid, instead of turning away, had said, "I can fix this." Not by giving him anything he did not already have, only by staying, and by turning the life they were living together into something worth staying for. This story, if you have been here from the beginning until now, isn't only a story. It is a reminder that even the darkest lives can find their way back to the light if someone is brave enough to stay, if someone looks at the wreckage and says, "I'm not leaving." In real life, not everyone has a Lenny with a notebook and 4 pages of proposals written in pencil, but each of us has someone who once stayed when they could have walked away, someone who once looked at the worst version of us and said, "I'm still here." And that small, ordinary thing is worth more than any empire. If this story touched you, if it made you think of someone who stayed in your life when everything was hard, or if it simply made you feel something warm in your chest, I want to hear that. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me your story. Tell me about the person who stayed, about the moment your life changed, because someone chose not to leave. I read every comment, and I want to hear from the deepest place in your heart. If you feel this story is worth retelling, please press the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe so we can listen to more moving stories together every day. Thank you for being here. I wish you and your family good health, peace, joy, and calm in every day ahead. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.